Thank you very much, Andrew, for doing this. Hello, everybody in YouTube watching the stream. Today we have the opening lecture for our autumn in Argentina festival 2024, that it's devoted to the Baroque in architecture. And today we have the big honor and opportunity to talk to Andrew Saunders. I have to say that I'm very excited about this, not only because I know the work that you do, Andrew, but also I admire the way you approach the material that you work with. And it's fantastic that you can present a very and profound and very disciplined work with the Baroque and a very contemporary approach to the style. That is something that we're trying to do with the activities that are embodied in the festival. So thank you again for doing this. I'm going to present you. I will try to be short so we can start with your own presentation. So Andrew Saunders is an associate professor of architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, Stuart Weitzman School of Design, and founding principal of Andrew Saunders Architecture Design, an internationally published award-winning architecture design and research practice committed to the tailoring of innovative digital methodologies to provoke novel exchange and reassessment of the broader cultural contexts. Well, he received his Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Arkansas and a Master in Architecture with distinction from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. His current practice and research interests lies in computational geometry as it relates to aesthetics, emerging technology, fabrication, and performance. He has significantly professional experience as project designer for Eisenman Architects, Lesser Architecture, and Preston Scott Cohen. Well, he has taught and guest lectured all around the world, and he has been recognized with awards also. And today, he will be presenting his latest updates on his now long-time research about the Baroque, specifically called Baroque Topologies. I won't be presenting longly the research, but I will say that there's a resume of the idea of the research that says that the era of big data has fostered the need for new approaches to analysis and representation in all fields of design, the ability to capture, record, and simulate increasingly larger sets of data, coupled with remote access to cloud computing and progressively more affordable additive fabrication technology provides new opportunities and methods for understanding and assessing complexity and representation in architecture. And Baroque Topologies studies a series of specific churches by some of the greatest architects of all time, like Francesco Borromini, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, Girolamo and Carlo Rainaldi, Pietro da Cortona, among many others. And we're going to see some of this work, not only the analysis work that you have, but also some of the exploration that you get to do in your university studios. So thank you very much, Andrew, for doing this, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Santiago, for the invitation, the opportunity to kind of present some of the research that I've done probably in the last 8 years now. It's getting since the sort of major breadth of Baroque topologies was done in terms of surveying around 2016, 17, and 18. But hopefully today I'll get to show you a little bit of that work. And then since that time, I've been working with students here at Penn each semester in a seminar and working with that material. And I'll show you some of the ways that we've kind of taken it further and explored it in a speculative realm as a way to kind of understand and interrogate these buildings and architects. Thanks. Share. Okay, great. So thank you for the introduction. As Santiago said, my name is Andrew Saunders. I'm an associate professor of architecture at the Penn Weitzman School of Architecture. I guess this series is titled Baroque and Roll. It was not my title, but I find the title quite intriguing and funny, so I'm happy to lead off that series. So as Santiago mentioned, just give you a brief history of my kind of background, where, you know, I'm not a historian in the kind of classical sense of it. I did not, you know, go through you know, PhD in history in Baroque or anything like that. I, you know, out of school, out of undergrad, began working for Eisenman Architects, working on large projects. This is one in Santiago, Spain. Also, I worked a bit with Preston Scott Cohen at Harvard GSD. This was kind of a project that I was involved in, which was the Tel Aviv Museum of Art. So essentially, you know, I've come to this more as a designer, and some of the background before that, I taught at Cooper Union and then went to RPI before Penn. And one of the things I taught at Cooper Union was their second year analysis class, which I always really influenced me quite a bit. It was the class that Peter Eisman typically taught. When I was at Cooper, we analyzed Corbusian villas for a whole semester. Students drew them, they modeled them, they worked through them without any design project at the end. It was just pure analysis, pure kind of close reading, enjoying the sort of luxury of academic space to explore a collection of work, an architect, and knowing it from a different perspective than one would outside of that kind of realm of the studio design environment. This is some of the work that I did at RPI, where I taught and coordinated their Rome program for a year, where we explored a lot of these churches in Rome. So the Borrominis, Bernini, Cortona, Rainaldi. We also explored some up in the Torino and Piedmont area of Guarini and Vittoni as well. And what we were looking at is the mathematical kind of consequences of using the main tool, which is the arc and the chord, which then can translate into trigonometric functions, looking at how these sort of polar geometries work. We had a great exhibition at the Italian Culture Institute in New York City, since some of the students' work. Since that point, I am now at Penn, and I think one of the reasons why they asked me to come to Penn was no one was really teaching history to designers that was kind of pre-1850. This project, Baroque Topologies, really looks at the Baroque and specifically the Baroque interiors. Baroque interiors, you know, are incredible. They are theaters and worlds in themselves. You know, the nature of the Baroque is the interior is a kind of an autonomous world that's separated from the exterior. And what I took on is actually a kind of survey of the major architects and their buildings and these kind of interiors. So I'd like to kind of ground the research a little bit. Obviously, the Baroque is important, but I think also this is an exercise in architectural representation. I think there's an incredible amount of space that architects need to kind of examine and try to understand how to bring into the discourse of representation around the use of LiDAR, reality capture, photogrammetry. And this is sort of a abbreviated history of where I think the architectural representation comes from. I typically in representation courses for designers, a lot of times it will start kind of in the middle of this with Renaissance and perspective and the perspective drawing machines, and as a kind of origin of architectural representation, which obviously is a very critical point in this lineage. But I think it's important to go back further than that when we're talking about architectural representation, and go back to the idea of surveying. So surveying really is at the origin of a lot of these kind of tools of representation. And, you know, for this kind of chronology, I began with some of the tools of the Egyptians, you know, starting with the Egyptian surveyors, very simple arc and chord. So they were able to use this rope to start to measure properties when the Nile flooded and develop certain trigonometric measurements in order to reappropriate different properties there. And they had a number of different other tools. They had the A-frame level, the maquette is a little bit more complex, deals with measuring stars and gravity. But the entire kind of outline here and these tools are really dedicated to generating and establishing a straight line. It's a bit of an ode to the straight line. And it's a pretty simple principle. And if we go all the way to the end of that with the 3D LiDAR scanner, this is one that I use for this surveying, the Faro Focus S350. It too is just like the arc and the chord, or just as the rope, dedicated and establishing straight lines and measurements from those straight lines, but one in a much more sophisticated and complex way using lasers. If we look at the lineage here, we go from the Egyptians and then we come to the Romans, which Romans were incredible builders and they contributed a number of tools. The hodometer, which is the survey's wheel, would wheel and drop a stone as they measured long distances. The dioptra, the chorobates, which was a leveling device. Probably the most famous was the groma here, which is really the origin of many European cities that were started in Roman camps. They would put the groma down, establish the principal directions, and make a grid. Something like Torino still embodies that in its urban morphology. And then if we kind of go to the Greeks were good builders as well, but I think they were far more radical and lasting because they really took the idea of measuring and surveying and introduced ideas of deductive reasoning and the kind of the notion of geometry, which quite literally translated is the measurement of the earth. And that's where we get the arc and the chord, which are tools used in the Baroque for architects, both for drawing, but then also for building. Probably most important thing and interesting to me is the Greeks, in their definition of geometry, would only allow figures that were encompassed with either a straight line or an arc or part of a circle, and that was their discipline. So everything from Euclidean geometry is derived from either straight lines or some notion of an arc. Then we get into the familiar perspective drawing machines, which were again about generating straight lines and recomposing those into perspective grids. There are a number of different devices Alberti created for measuring sculpture, which are kind of predecessors of the laser scanner, and then eventually the theodolite, which is an engineering tool, and then the 3D laser scanning. So the point being that this project deals with LiDAR scanning, but I think it is in the realm of architectural representation. This is a kind of quick slide showing the tool that I use, and a lot of people ask. And so, you can see it's a relatively small device that is placed on a tripod. This device then spins in 360 degrees, sending out a laser and receiving the information back from that. So you get a very precise measurement and a point. So it produces millions of points, and then it's combined with a photograph so that you embed RGB values into those points. And, you know, when I did the survey in 2016, 17, 18, it was a really critical point in development for LiDAR, where when you survey, you do a number of these kind of point-placed readings, and then you come back and you composite them all together. Previously, it was required that you would put physical targets and spheres in the space so that when you came back to composite them, you could match them. But computation had evolved enough to where now you can register all of these scans without doing physical targets, because computationally you can recognize different similar patterns and start to recompose them. So for me, you know, in this survey, that was really helpful. I could just put the laser scanning you know, device in you know, in a backpack and go to these churches, as long as I had permission, and could just scan there and then bring that information back without having to set up anything out in the kind of environment. So with that, I introduce kind of a few key figures. Obviously, I'm not the first person to go to Rome or go to Italy and survey. So there's a number of surveys that kind of influenced me and this survey. One of it, which was Auguste Choisy, which this was one of his first published works, where he went and surveyed the Roman baths. And what's fascinating, I mean, there's a number of things fascinating about these drawings. One of which is, at that time, there was a very, you know, very big interest in domes and vaults. And in order to represent those domes and vaults, those interior spaces, Choisy really wanted a more scientific method than perspective. So he essentially invented a whole new representational medium for looking up into these, which was we typically call the worm's eye axometric. And you can see in these worm's eye, he was a structural engineer, a French structural engineer, who was really also concerned with how these vaults were structured. And you can kind of see the weight of these vaults sort of coming down within the columns and kind of cut out with no ground. They levitate, and it's really focused on that. You know, later in Choisy's career, he operates with this same worm's eye axometric as a representational device to tell the entire history of architecture. And his history books were, you know, hugely influential on many people, especially here at Penn. Louis Kahn. It's an interesting way. It's a radical way to tell the history of architecture, because these worm's eye axons really don't show anything about the exterior of the buildings. They don't show anything about the context of those buildings. They really focus, they actually don't even show the complete buildings. They really focus on structural bays and showing the evolution of those structural bays through this worm's eye perspective, all the way up. You know, his history books kind of go all the way up to the Renaissance. They don't go into the Baroque, you know, oddly enough. Another survey of Rome that everyone is familiar with, I would assume, would be the Noli map here by Giovanni Battista Noli in 1748. I think that most people are familiar with its black and white figure ground representation. It was one of the first scientific mappings of Rome. What people may not be familiar with, if you look at this image all the way down here to the bottom right, you'll see there's kind of cherub that's drawing on this rotating survey table. This was a radical device that allowed Noli to not only survey more quickly, but also survey in the field. And I would say that, again, could be a sort of predecessor to the laser scanner as well. But this allowed the mapping to happen quickly and accurately as well. Now, when we look at the Noli map, you'll see a number of the works that I'm going to show you in relationship to Baroque churches. The figure ground representation seems very binary and straightforward, but it's really actually more complex and more ambiguous, because the interior spaces of these churches are documented in white, and they're documented in the same sort of format or codification as the exterior spaces. So here we have Piazza di Popolo, which is white. It's an exterior public plaza, and the interiors of these public buildings are then also white. So interior and exterior are represented in the same way, even though they're very different. But what you get are these really interesting figures of the interior spaces that start to be embedded within the kind of poche of these other kind of black figures, right? Just these interior figures of this kind of autonomy of the interior. And here's a few others. If you kind of go through, here's Piazza Navono, so Sant'Ivo is here. San Maria Agnesi is here. There's a few other Baroque churches within this sector. This one is probably one of the most famous areas for Baroque churches, where you have on the Coronale, you have Borromini's church here, and you have Bernini's San Andrea, and you have San Carlino here. It's really interesting to go back and forth between these churches. And it's really interesting to see how very small the interior figure is in the rest of the kind of urban grid. Another more contemporary surveyor of Italy, or of Italian architecture, was Luigi Moretti, who was a kind of a modernist architect and teacher in Rome. He actually founded his own magazine titled Spazio, which is Italian for space. This is one of my favorite issues, Spazio issue number 7, where he started to look at all the Italian architecture, the lineage of that, through the lens of this idea of figuring the space. So he was making plaster models of just the interior space as figures, right? So in this sequence of structures, you'll see here a number of the more kind of famous Italian spaces back and forth. This is entrance to Adrian's garden, or sorry, Adrian's villa. Long entrance sequence is then modeled in plaster as a solid. There's others with Urbino piazzas, Farnese, Palladio, St. Peter. St. Peter is very interesting because it's a sequence of 4 or 5 major additions from Michelangelo all the way on. But probably the most interesting of these figures were the Baroque. This one to the right is a Guarini church, and actually an unbuilt project that comes from Guarini's book, but really sort of odd figures in them. Also, big influence on this is Henrik Wolflin and his Renaissance and Baroque, and it's a really fascinating book. It's a really short book, and I'd recommend it to everyone. But it was his second book right after his dissertation, where he was looking at the psychology of architecture. So starting to develop an idea of formalism, where one could start to assess art and architecture through more empirical means, and looking at the kind of newly forming science in terms of perception and psychology, and trying to take some of those principles and use those to assess architecture. So he writes his first book, Renaissance and Baroque, to test these principles. And in there, he really pits the Baroque kind of against the Renaissance, where I would say the Renaissance is the sort of good, perfect patient, and the Baroque is a little bit outside of that realm. And if you look at the way that he describes the Renaissance, he uses terms like elegant, harmonious, graceful, light, self-contained, individualistic, tectonic, calm, beautiful, uniform, perfect, born easily, free, complete, broad, pleasing, satisfactory, heavenly, content, content, slow, quiet, enduring, and fulfilling. On the other side, the Baroque, is a much more different description in terms of psychological characteristics of broad, massive, heavy, dissonant, amorphous, formless, imprisoned, unevolved, incomplete, immediate, intimidating, overwhelming, exciting, ecstatic, intoxicating, momentary, desolating, anticipating, dissatisfactory, restless, intense. And then another kind of background on the survey is I chose really what I consider the 6 most important Italian Baroque architects. Certainly there were more, and this could expand further, but I think these were the 6 that I felt most important to document in the short amount of time. And it's really important to understand, especially as contemporary, that these architects really didn't have formal architectural training, and they come from different interests and different backgrounds, and those kind of motivate what I would say are their tropes, and how can we start to tell the difference between all of these Baroque architects and their architectural consequences. So in Rome, there was obviously Francesco Borromini, who is trained as a mason and a master builder. There's Bernini, who is a child prodigy sculptor, so really comes at it from a sculptural sensibility. Cortona is sort of the master painter, so his projects are painterly, quite literally. Carlo Rainaldi is probably the closest to trained architects coming from the north, but it's interesting to see when he gets to Rome how these all of these kind of mix together and sort of influence his. To the north, but 100 years later, when the kind of economy shifts to Torino as kind of new capital, we have the work of Guarini, who is really trained as a mathematician, and then further down, one of his predecessors, Bernardo Vittoni, probably the least known of the 6, but really amazing, is really invested in light, and I would call him the luminaire, really sort of opening up a lot of these projects as they kind of delaminate and really start to fill what typically was heavy and poche with light and other things as it kind of makes its way into the interior of these churches. So quick map, here's a number of the churches that were surveyed in Rome, which obviously took a while to, all of the survey really was done in a month and a half, which is quite astonishing. I think being on tenure track always is a motivator. But when I originally talked to Faro, they agreed to lend me the laser scanner for surveying of one building for the month, and I was lucky to have contacts from previous teaching in Italy, and was able to gain access. So the big part of this research really that isn't visible is actually going to get permission to survey all of these churches. It takes quite a while, and you really need to be on the ground and working every day to get permission, because there's a number of different levels of permission you need for these churches. So, you know, a lot of the work was just getting the permissions and not necessarily just being on the ground and surveying. I would say that actually the major part of the surveying happened in the kind of latter half of the month and a half. And then here's a map of Torino and some of the other churches that are off this map that are in the Piedmont area, kind of surrounding Torino. So there's a few different types of what I would call novel representational techniques that come out of this survey. And the first one we'll talk about is the painterly and the point cloud. So these are some of the results from that. Obviously, the point cloud itself is pretty fascinating, where a lot of these scans, depending on how many different positions were taken and then composited together, add up in the millions. So, you know, typically a church would have up to 16 million points. So San Carlino by Borromini is here. So all those points put together produced a really interesting way to see these interiors. And I would say a new way to see these interiors, where you can view them from the exterior as an object, but also still see the interior. So kind of seeing the inside from the outside in this sort of different diaphanous sort of bodies is really fascinating, because you never really get to see them holistically in that sense. So these are some of those representations that came from this one. Here is San Luca y Martina from Cortona, his only kind of ground up full church. Here's Bernini's San Andrea that I was referring to as well. I mean, it's also really amazing that you are able to collect the color data as well. So that makes a huge difference when really starting to understand somebody like Bernini. Here's a few of Borromini's, the Rimage and the Propaganda and San Carlo. But this gives us kind of a new privileged view that we don't really get from visiting or from previous representations. And one of the things that I've enjoyed about this project is that the Baroque is, you know, is very complex, both formally, spatially, materially, and even photography of it really never captures all of that together in one area. So these kind of representations start to put all that together in a very interesting way and make it more accessible. There's the courtyard of San Carlino. Here's Dolori, which was one of the first scans that I did, because now it's actually a private hotel and permissions were not as difficult for this particular church than some of the others that are still really active and under different jurisdictions. There's Rainaldi, a few Rainaldi projects. Guarini, Torino. Vittoni and Torino, Samaria di Piazza, which is amazing for all the different types of vaults that are contained within just this one church. And another thing that became fascinating once you acquire the scan data is that you no longer have to view it from the ground level. You can then start to interrogate the model with different viewpoints. So we start to see these interiors from different vantage points. So here are some of those kind of views. And also, you know, some of, you know, really, I was really fortunate to have some really great contacts. These two are very difficult to access if you're just going to Rome, but, you know, Borromini's rectilinear space at the Oratory, and then, which is one of his earlier projects, to one of his later projects, a rectilinear space at with the Chapel of Rimage at the Propaganda, kind of complex, you know, and you can start to see the evolution as an architect back and forth, but these are very, very difficult to access if you're just going to Rome. Looking at the nave of Capitelli by Rainaldi, really probably Rainaldi's masterpiece. And St. Ignazio in Rome as well, which is kind of a hybrid church where Rainaldi Sr. started it. Borromini worked on the exterior primarily, but did do work on the interior, and then Rainaldi Jr. comes back and finishes the interior. So it really is quite interesting. Somebody like Deleuze would point out that this is the epitome of the Baroque, because the interior and the exterior don't really relate to one another. They both have their autonomy, and with this church, it's further accentuated because you have two different architects working on it. San Lorenzo by Guarini. Now, a third type of representation that came out of this is one of my favorites, and at the time, you know, and I think still it's pretty difficult to do in terms of high resolution. How does one take what accounts for 15, 16 million points, and how do you generate a solid mesh from those? And at the time when I was doing this, we had really great relationship with Autodesk, and Autodesk is investing quite a bit to developing their reality capture and different aspects of that. And one of the projects Autodesk was working on is turning point clouds from scans into meshes, and they were doing that for an engineering service that would survey oil platforms. And the reason why they needed a mesh was when they wanted to go back in and refit it with different infrastructure, they needed to have a mesh in order to detect collisions. So they were working on a project and had set up cloud computing in order to put all the millions of points together for these oil platforms, and was really thankful that they allowed us to use that cloud platform in order to start to send through these Baroque churches. And I think the people at Autodesk were really surprised to see these come in at the same time. At the time we were doing that, it was really a black box kind of project where we would send it and have to wait for a few days. And sometimes we got nothing out of it. Other days we would kind of open it up and render it and just start to see these absolutely amazing views of these kind of interior spaces, from the outside as just pristine and high fidelity objects. So these are some of the results coming back from the meshes. Again, not like the point clouds, they're completely solid. But what's nice is that also the color is embedded within those meshes as well. These meshes are very large. They're all 50 gigs each. If one wanted to 3D print these at a 1-to-1 scale, you could completely reproduce these churches if that was the goal. But what you see from a kind of Baroque sensibility is you see how there's a challenging of the central plan from the Renaissance, where they didn't abandon it, but they start to challenge its centrality and its sort of static center by introducing new centers, multiple centers, this kind of distortion of it back and forth. San Carlino is kind of, one of the poster childs of this, with multiple new polar centers put in and combined into one to get what was considered a Serlian oval, which allows a certain flexibility in the way that you draw that. San Ivo, obviously one of the few churches that has a plan that is not circular, that does not have pendentives. So typically, if you have a cruciform plan, you resolve to the dome through the use of pendentives to transition from the two different geometries. Evo is really interesting because it has a complex plan and resolves into a dome or quasi-dome without the use of pendentives. So it's all embodied within the kind of geometrical transition. Here are the two Borromini spaces that I was referring to previously, the oratory and Ramage. It's really interesting to see. I mean, oratory had quite a complex situation in terms of what Borromini had come into and trying to negotiate all the forces, and from the exterior to the existing complex. Ramage, is more of a, I would call it a perfect work. It embodies the golden ratio, on many, many levels. It's really a very perfect kind of calibrated church, but also it mixes ideas of Gothic, Renaissance, all of these things in one. It's really an amazing project. These are the twin churches, both begun and planned by Rainaldi. The one on the right, Montesanto, was finished later by Bernini. The one on the left is entirely Rainaldi. And so you can start to see the differences of those interventions. Here's Rinaldi's Capitelli. Very interesting as a sort of combination of a number of elements that don't necessarily add up to a perfect whole. It's kind of it's a contested addition of parts to whole, where it's almost a Frankenstein of these elements, and they're brought together and sutured with a really strong cornice. There are a few others by Rainaldi, Agnesi again. Really fascinating how the colors are absorbed, but not only just the pure colors, but if you look over here where light is starting to come in, you can see it's sort of washed out at certain areas, and other areas of the church have different lighting according to principles of chiaroscuro, where certain parts of the church had greater lighting, others were darker, so that becomes registered in these scans as well. Guarini, San Lorenzo, and Immaculate Conception. Kind of the area, where some of these Baroque effects of the painterly that were previously done with, with painting and coffers start to become fully architectural, and the sort of cupola becomes completely separated, allowing light in, and with the kind of new structural logic. And here's Vittoni. These are really interesting to me as far as scans, because you start to get the figures of all of these delaminations. So like Santa Chiara on the left, it doesn't actually look like this in reality, but what you're getting are the figures and the frescoes that the laser scanner can pick up as it kind of goes through the different perforations. And so these figures that end up on the side are the kind of layers of what you can actually see, or what the laser scanner can see, and it sort of depicts it in a really interesting new way. And here's another Vittoni, Santa Maria's Piazza, and just look at all the different types of vaults that are within just this one kind of project. And the fourth kind of representational technique that came out of this, again, probably will definitely motivate it by the previous plaster molds that we saw, is the idea of, can we then take these meshes and enclose them and actually 3D print the physical figures of them. So these figures are made from resin. They're 3D resin prints, completely solid. The resin is supposed to be clear and totally transparent, but when it gains that kind of density, you start to see it has, you know, this deep bluish or purplish effect with those. And when I showed the Moretti earlier, the white plaster casts, which are fantastic, but you see in his modernist kind of streamlining of those, they don't have any of the articulation or the ornament or anything within them, and they're completely solid. These do have those and maintain the ornament, the detail, and also they're transparent, so it highlights them a little bit differently. Here are photos of those, trying to photograph them in a similar way that Moretti did. And then they're pretty amazing as you actually light them, and they start to illuminate in this way to kind of show a lot of the detail here. Bernini's San Andrea and his altarpiece, which is one of my favorite kind of areas where there's a lot of this kind of mixing between the architecture, the painting, and the sculpture all come together in this notion of bel composto, where they're very hard to distinguish and pull out together. And the resin models start to really show that in a fascinating way. You can see also up in the dome, it seems like there's areas where maybe the 3D printing messed up or errors, but it really isn't. This is actually that bel composto plaster angel figures that sit around the dome, so they start to negotiate and stitch together or question some of the kind of orders of the architecture as well. So that work was then published in my book, Baroque Topologies, by Palombi Editoria, Italian publisher, and came out in 2018. And it was a great success. You know, it was, you know, a large volume of these churches that have never been seen in this way, hopefully to kind of show them in a new way and create interest from different audiences. But since that point, I've also used that material and brought it into my Baroque seminar where I teach here at Penn, and we've started to look at that with the students and kind of challenge them to say, you know, in the lineage of formal analysis, that we kind of have a first part of the semester where we kind of understand the Baroque, but we also understand the lineage from Wolflin to a number of other figures, all the way to Rowe, Vitkover, Eisenman, President Scott Cohen. I would say putting these together, this kind of formal legacy of each one of those figures starts to take a kind of different discursive approach to close reading and formal analysis, that's also influenced by their tools in which they kind of draw or interrogate these projects. So part of the goal of that seminar is to understand that history and to ask the students, now what do we do that we have this different form of representation with the LiDAR scan? How can we start to kind of add a new chapter to that? So some of the basic outcomes of that is actually, if you redraw the sections or plans or any of the kind of traditional documentation of these churches, they're quite different than what exists, because a lot of them haven't been drawn from the as-built conditions. So this was an example of Campitelli, where it's actually drawn completely accurate to the scan, which looks very different than any of the kind of sections that you'll find that were typically drawn before the project was built and never kind of remeasured. We're looking at, these meshes and how we can understand those as figures. A lot of students kind of working through typical analysis, finding golden sections, ratios, geometrical analysis through those. These were an exercise where we speculated that if Choisy would have continued his history books and included the Baroque, so these are very much motivated by the Choisy worm's eye axons and kind of recreating that for the Baroque. This is a series that one semester, and typically in the semesters, I ask the students, we have a debate, and students will bring different examples of things that we can do representationally now with this material. This particular class decided that we wanted to make these kaleidoscopic images that showed all angles of the interior and all angles of the exterior of the interior together, and they're completely oblique projections, meaning there's no perspectival distortion on these as well. So these are a series of these kind of kaleidoscopic obliques with each one of the churches, so Guarini, Bottoni. And you can see the other figures here: Borromini, San Carlino, Oratory by Borromini, Dolori by Borromini, Evo by Borromini. These two are Bernini, so San Andrea, and then another church that's just slightly outside of Rome in Aricia. Other figures here, another Borromini, Rimage, Agnesi. Here we get the two twin churches by Rainaldi. Rainaldi again with Campitelli, and then two Vittonis and one Guarini. Or yes. Another semester, same exercise, students decided that they wanted to work with these interiors and take the models and start to unfold them. So how could they start to unfold the entire interior to sort of map it out and show it as one drawing with these meshes? And it was a really interesting process where students were having to decide where and how they wanted to kind of cut the meshes and start to rotate and hinge them in certain ways. Also, in terms of the colors that you see here are not the original colors of the church. We actually were looking at ways to analyze where curvature and articulation occur within these churches. So we rendered it with a gradient where the kind of bluish that you see has zero curvature or the most flat, and then those areas that have the higher articulation, such as in Bernini's case with the plaster, garlands and these kind of things, or the fluted pilasters, those become the other end of the spectrum, which are orange. So it's really a mapping of the articulation within these churches and an unfolding of the interiors. So this became a consistent series of taking the entire collection and working to make that representation uniform across the collection too. So it's the notion of a survey is at one point the actual act of surveying and measuring a building, but there's also the idea of a survey as a collection as well. So we try to document the entire survey in the same way each semester with these kind of, so we can start to look at these all together through the same lens. And some of them, you know, they require, you know, quite a bit of decision making about how students want to unfold this. We kind of had a rule that we wanted to keep all pieces of the interior within the same drawing. So you see some sides of the churches are then are kind of flipped and mirrored. Certain ends are situated at one bottom of the drawing and on the upper level. So they kind of are a little bit bipolar in the way they represent. These kind of flip over and start to do that. So it's a really kind of interesting exercise of unrolling and unwrapping these high definition interior meshes. So I'm not sure about the time, but I'll go through these pretty quickly. But one of the things that's really interesting is then students really look at the tropes of these architects and how they're different from one another using the scan material. And I'm going to get through these pretty quickly, but Cortona, like I was saying in the beginning, you know, really comes from it from a painterly way. And if you understand that, then you can understand that the church, you know, completely is on different layers, just in the way he would use layers in his perspective, right? And so this is San Luca. It's one church, and students kind of going through and finding all those layers and just exploding those meshes to kind of demonstrate how many layers there are in relationship to his approach to painting, which produces these layers of depth as well. Rainaldi, like I said before, you know, very interesting figure. He has these disparate parts that are kind of, you know, I would say don't necessarily go together proportionally. It's a bit of a Frankenstein and add up to a difficult whole, which questions the idea of perfection. So these students kind of took all of the cornices out, but stitch them together and start to put those larger elements back together within this. So you can start to understand how Rainaldi operates a little bit more differently than other architects, and that sort of grew into what we called Rainaldi's labyrinth. So these are the type of drawings and analysis that we're producing out of the seminar, which are the purpose is really just to have a closer reading, kind of understanding of this work, right, through these architectural analytical models. This is another one of Rainaldi taking apart all those pieces, recompositing them in different ways to start to understand how many pieces and elements are really at play within those interiors. more Rainaldi analysis. Bernini, like earlier we're talking about, comes from a sculptural aspect, really only had 3 ground up whole projects from, as churches. Really didn't do that much architecture per se. He did a lot of altars, a lot of pieces of sculpture, but the 3 churches that he had is, were all scanned in this survey. So these students took on that, and they took on this notion of bel composto, which is the kind of perfect mixing of the arts of architecture, sculpture, and painting. So they started to look at different areas of those 3 Bernini churches and started to pull out different elements of these kind of bel compostos. A lot of the plaster figures, and they started to look at, when you put those back together, how can they challenge certain thresholds and certain ideas just from simple geometries. And so these are some of the results of those kind of plaster pieces, all reconfigured in one piece from those 3 churches. More Bernini analysis, looking at similar ideas with the 2 kind of domes in Castle Gandolfo and the Arici Church, bringing in other figures from San Andrea as well. Different approach to Bernini. This one was using some AI approaches to multiply this kind of bel composto even more than it is. So, in this amazing altar piece in San Andrea, where you have angels and cherubs just filling and spilling through that oculus onto the painting, onto the architecture, it's multiplied even more here to kind of highlight that. So again, I think these are different types of models and different types of drawings than could have been done previously without the scan that gives you the high resolution, gives you the complete figuration, and also all of the colors and material richness. And I think the students are then beginning to work with that in a completely new way than was possible before, to essentially generate a better understanding about how these architects are operating differently than one another as their kind of tropes. Borromini, certainly geometry, he's an architect's favorite. Probably the most complex in terms of geometry, maybe next to Guarini as a mathematician. These students were looking at hybridizing different polar geometries from the 3 kind of major churches, San Carlino, San Ivo, Rimage, and then looking at different ways in which they could take those sort of bays and create hybrid models of those. This project was looking at the ordering system of Borromini's pilasters, which has some interesting AB rhythms, and this was taking all of those from those main sequences and kind of understanding those figure ground relationships that they produce. And then, even though we talk about Bernini mostly as the sculptor, Borromini has elements that are binary all throughout his work, and they're always kind of pushing, pulling, kind of pushing on, off, push, pull. So these students went through and registered all those elements. So ionic capitals have different volutes at different direction. Certain balustrades have different orientation with, thicker, lower, higher, kind of a trick he took from Michelangelo. Certain niches are on, off, up, down. Angels' wings are open, closed, open, closed. Vaulting is kind of pushing up, down, back and forth. And so taking all of those elements and combining them into this sort of hybrid model to show all of those kind of Borromini elements together in one. Guarini, like I said before, is a mathematician. You know, a little bit different approach to Borromini, but I think there certainly are similarities. Everything that Guarini did was extremely polar, and it was about these spheres pushing and pulling on one another. These are different ways in which students start to take apart San Lorenzo and start to rotate them in relationship to those polar centers and kind of unfold the interiors on these kind of hinges that exist within the original interior. And finally, last, Vittoni and these kind of delaminated vaults, which were really fascinating. They're super thin. You know, at the time, yeah, I mean, if you look at the survey, this is the work. It's the latest, you know, in the Baroque, and you know, the structure is starting to become, even though it's still load bearing, the masonry is very thin and allowing all of these vaults to be nested and exist together. So these are a series of vault objects that start to show that taxonomy within Vittoni's work. You see here certain areas where he will pierce pendentives. So pendentives are typically solid, but at this point they're light enough where it can actually poke holes through them and bring light through. Very kind of a very specific trope of Vittoni. And these are some hybrid models that are kind of taking those vaults apart, and all the kind of Vittonis starting to amplify and magnify those. Then other students looked at this in terms of hybrid approaches, not just one architect or church being analyzed. This one student took all the cupolas and started to mix and merge the points and then remesh them together. So depending on different weights of points from different authors, you get some interesting kind of hybrid domes that have elements of all of them together. These are some additional kind of chunk objects, as we would call them, where looking at different objects from each architect as well and putting them together in different ways. This student wanted to make new churches from all the pieces of the others, and took that all the way into making new plans and also new names and for the churches and the architects as well. Took that narrative all the way through. So you get interesting new hybrids or possible Baroque churches that never existed. I'm not sure how we're doing on time, but I'm sure the last time I ran this course, we decided that we wanted to kind of return to the points. A lot of the previous work had been done with the meshes, and really want to see, can we operate on the points in a different way? So in this, I was really happy to kind of return to a lot of the original scans, because you have the original colors in those. And we worked with point cloud software. We happened to work with Houdini in this case, and also introduce ideas of forces that then could start to manipulate and reconfigure those points and colors. It was a interesting exercise. I mean, it's actually, you know, quite computationally heavy, and it's a lot to kind of move through. But what we settled on at the end is that each student was doing kind of a series of basically 4 drawings where they were trying to keep certain identifiable features of the church intact, such as cornices or altars, and letting other kind of points be a little bit more free to kind of highlight or frame those pieces. So we had sort of a cornice drawing, altar drawing, these kind of things. So this is some of the work that comes from that particular way of looking now back at the points. So this is Bernini's in Aricia. This is another Bernini in Castel Gandolfo, which is the Pope's sort of summer residence, slightly outside of Rome. Fascinating kind of altar piece, you know, put together, sort of quintessential Bernini bel composto, but now at even more hyper agitation of that. Bernini San Andrea. Borromini San Ivo. So you can see here trying to keep the signature cornice that reflects the plan and dome pieces, and then letting others kind of start to fray and frame that. The interesting thing is that, you know, when you scan, you really are only getting a surface. You're never getting any depth. So both the meshes and the point cloud are very thin. You know, they have no materiality. One of the things that I enjoyed about this, you know, in addition to it just being another way to kind of look closely, interrogate these projects, is it starts to build volume and this new kind of poche out of the points. So that sort of thinness is kind of challenged from the scans. San Carlino and certain figures alter here. I mean, even though Borromini wasn't really known for color, typically it's monolithic, white plaster, these kind of things, might be some gold. It's actually really interesting to see the colors that come from these scans, some of these kind of purplies and other things, because of the different way in which the light is registered within these churches when trying to balance the light uniformly, which is kind of the mechanism of the scanner to try to get an even balance. But because these churches have different levels of light in different areas, you get a lot of this this kind of residue, which I find fascinating, becomes very colorful. San Carlino courtyard. This is Bernini's oratory. Ramage by Borromini. Delori. I really like some of the edges of these kind of pieces, so they no longer are thin. It sort of plays an interesting game that creates even more illusion of thickness around it. And this is Cortona. This is actually Cortona's ceiling from Palazzo Barberini, which I was able to scan in a recent trip back. So it was nice to kind of just work on that with the colors in his masterpiece. Rinaldi, again, you're getting the sort of richness of those colors from the marble, starting to mix with the richness of the colors of the frescoes. And then those kind of strong features of both the columns and different architectural elements strong cornice. These kind of things remain stable, and other points are allowed to bleed into others around this. More Rainaldi, Campitelli. Rainaldi's twin churches. Another kind of minor Rainaldi project was more, he did additions to this kind of early, first century kind of Roman church and origins, but again, really incredible colors range that comes out of that. Guarini's San Lorenzo. Guarini Immaculate Conception. San Maria Piazza by Vittoni. San Chiara by Vittoni. Again, you start to see a lot of that delamination in between vaults. So some vaults were kept pretty solid, then other vaults are allowed to start to disintegrate and come through. And finally, other Vittoni. And I think that's all that I have really for today. I have to say, the point clouds were a really interesting way to approach it. I think probably maybe the more radical in terms of dealing with those, even though they're a little bit more difficult to precisely kind of nail down what's at stake in terms of both formal analysis and geometry. They've been really, for me, eye-opening and a lot of fun to go through the churches with those students and really look closely at those elements and really try to showcase them. So anyway, I think that's it for me. Santiago, are you there?
Yeah. I'm here. If you want, you can keep sharing so we can go through some of the images. I had to say that the presentation was as overwhelming as the topic of the Baroque. So it's quite incredible to see all this material together. So thank you for that. Thank you for the generosity of sharing. I have a lot of questions, a lot of comments, but I will try to reduce them as much as I can. I know also that we had some trouble in the streaming, so we'll make sure that we're going to post the entire uncut version of your presentation, so it is accessible for everyone online. But let me just start with some questions. And again, if someone wants to ask Andrew anything about the presentation, you can post it on the YouTube chat, and I will read them to him. So what to say? It's a lot of work. It's a lot of years of work. It's amazing. I will start with an idea that I think it's some authors have talked about, and I've been thinking about that for a long time, and maybe you have. It's some sort of a lateral comment. I have a lot of specific comments about the work, but this is kind of a lateral comment about the Baroque, and maybe you can give some insight about it because of what you have researched and known. But there's this idea of Baroque architects. Some Baroque architects are working with a density in geometry, like you may find Borromini or Guarini. But then there's like the more sculptured ones that work with a pretty simple structure, complete static structure, but they put a lot of addition into it. And sculpture, for example, plays an essential role. there's an exercise that you can do mentally, that if you get rid of the sculptures in San Carlino, you will get a very Baroque building nevertheless. But if you do the same with Sant'Andrea, it will be weird, because most of the ecstasis effect that is produced in Bernini is through the sculptures. So I don't know if this is something that you think about or that you saw during this incredible survey that you went through.
Yeah, it's a really great question. I mean, certainly, well, I think that, Bernini and Borromini are probably the two most known, and I think that typically, I mean, I may be wrong, but especially when I was educated, maybe it's changing a little bit. Borromini was a bit more champion because he was, master builder. His geometry may be more complex, more holistic as a project, the way that he drew, the way that he thought about the spaces, his sort of commitment to them. I think that the interesting thing for me, though, is a lot of that is you can kind of represent through, let's say, modern conventions. So if you're doing analysis, with hardline reconstruction of plans and sections and these things, you can redraw a lot of that and represent it and understand it pretty well. I think the other, the figuration, what's happening, the kind of literalness, the kind of materialness of the marble, the colors, all of these kind of things are much more difficult to redocument or analyze it from kind of traditional, let's say, architectural analysis or compositional analysis, something along those lines. And for me, that's been one of the interesting things about this survey, is that, other figures that, of course, I'm a big Borromini fan, but I think it's helped me to really kind of understand and appreciate, obviously, Bernini, but other people like Cortona and Rainaldi and Vittoni in a much different light, and really working with students to sort of bring out their tropes. They're very different. So those sort of 6 architects are all, have some similarities and are kind of grouped together as sort of Baroque architects, but they're all trying to do very different things. And I think that the idea of, representation in the Baroque, I mean, and really trying to access that. I mean, obviously the best thing is to go and be there, but, teaching in Philadelphia, where, we don't travel for the seminar, and kind of bringing that to students, having the scans in addition to that other material is also eye-opening, I think, and brings to the forefront some of those things you were discussing outside of just compositional and geometry that are so championed in Bernini, if that makes sense. I mean, yes, like Bernini, you're talking about Sant'Andrea versus Carlino. I mean, all of Bernini's 3 churches are very classic. They're essentially an oval plan, a cruciform, and a central circular plan. For instance, Aricia is considered his little pantheon, right? So sometimes the domes become elongated. They're a little bit more parabolic than perfect half spheres. But if you look at his architecture just from pure analysis compositionally of the partie, one would say that they might not even fit into that sort of Baroque canon because they're so classical. It's really what he does and how he operates it through the ideas of he's, typical mannerist. And my kind of definition of a mannerist would be somebody that understands the rules, sets up the rules, and then knows how to break the rules within their own project. So for me, Bernini is setting up very classic parties that then he goes through his own sort of tropes and his own understanding and starts to manipulate and break those rules through his sculpture and the painting and starting to mix these things together, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, totally. In fact, there's the text about the book of Wolfling that you mentioned is in fact that is not very well known, that it's one of the firsts of a series of books trying to talk about the Baroque in a very positive way, because, well, you know that the Baroque in the beginning was a way to diminish this architecture that was like over showing off, and it was using a lot of ornament with no real meaning, and it was like a sacrilege to the Renaissance architecture that was trying to bring back all these classical ideas. So, but in that sense, what I was thinking about is that can you imagine some other, I don't want to say style, but other architecture that works with same ideas or similar ideas, like trying to be something that is overwhelming, that produces some sort of ecstasy and some sort of impact, but not in a way that is trying to showing off something or to bring back some historic idea or trying to send a message. It seems to me that Baroque architecture is like an effect just for the quality and the impression of that effect. I don't know if I'm being so clear, but there is some sort of dignity in that kind of work with the Baroque. I don't know. I'm thinking about, for example, some postmodernistic architectures that are using the site, right, the historic reference to send a message, to say something about society, to say something about culture. Do you think there's some sort of message behind the language of the Baroque, or there's some sort of its own language,
it's
like trying to
yeah,
their own language?
I mean, yeah, it's a really good question. Certainly in the way that Wolflin pits them as very opposite, right? The Renaissance is, this ideal, the Baroque is the antithesis to that, right? Where, a lot of the criticism of Wolflin's, is that was too simple of an argument, and then it also left out a whole middle section of mannerism that was between the Renaissance and the Baroque. So if you look at that, in terms of your question about the sort of historic reference, right? Like some would argue that the Baroque was a new Renaissance, and it really was the first modern architecture in the sense that it was dealing with kind of new modern complexities of the world that were happening in terms of the sort of Enlightenment, or the oncoming Enlightenment and these kind of things. And it was, it has a certain multiplicity that aims at being a little bit more pure and Renaissance-like, as opposed to being opposite of Renaissance. Now, that being said, one of the things I've always kind of liked about the Baroque is that it never abandoned that sort of central plan of the Renaissance. Really, it contested it, right? And works within the rules to offset it and try to produce something else outside of that, and that's an interesting kind of tactic that I'm not entirely sure. I mean, it depends on which postmodern architecture you're talking about, but I'm not sure many of the postmodern that are using these historical references quite literally had that same sort of ambition to modify its sort of structure or its DNA, right? It would seem more about an idea of sign and an idea of language and an idea of bringing that back to represent something, not really working within the system. I don't know if that answers the question, but
yeah, totally. Well, I'm talking a little bit more about the specific work that you did. I was thinking all the time about how churches are used, because the problem of how a church is used is it was very well explored during the Renaissance, because the celebrations inside the churches changed and evolved, and there was this argument about Saint Peter, that it changed originally from a central organization to a more linear organization, adding the front piece and all that. So looking at the transformations and alterations and 3D collages and proliferations of geometries that you showed in your experiments with the Baroque seminar, I was wondering if you at any moment consider how the effective use of the church will change, or will produce a new way to approach some of the activities inside the church, considering on top of that they're more like monuments now, right? They're not, although San Carlino is, to name one, is still being used as a regular church. We can consider them like sort of monuments that has no specific function. But I was wondering if it came to mind, working with this transformation, the problem of function, and how you will be able to use them on top of the effect, on top of the sensation that you're obviously looking for in those explorations.
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly, that was one of the major factors that really kind of launched the Baroque, was the Council of Trent and this sort of Reformation and kind of trying to bring the Catholic Church at that time into a little bit more modernity that allowed people like Caravaggio to paint figures and these things. And one of the emphasis was on the kind of ceremonial and procedural logics of the Mass, which don't lend themselves to a central plan, right? So that's one of the reasons they wanted them to start to become more directional and more linear as a certain sense, and challenge that kind of Renaissance, because the Renaissance central plan was not very functional in the aspect of the daily kind of rituals of the Catholic Mass. So that's one thing, that it was that sort of rule that no longer they could support centrally planned church, that caused these Baroque architects to really start to push and pull those centers, and that's why they're all quasi spherical or quasi central. They're opened up and they have certain geometric multiplicity because they resist that sort of stagnant centrality of the Renaissance that was before that. But then I think if you certainly fast forward to today, I mean, these particular churches are all in use. Even the one Delori, which is now a great hotel. I recommend any architects listening, if they're in Rome for a day or two, to stay there. But that's actually still operational. That there's a convent, small number, that still are having Mass within that. So in my experience of surveying these, every single one of them is completely functional and has daily. I mean, and one of them when I was doing scanning Borromini's sort of vault, you know, I was down there and then I came back up and the mass had started and I was behind the altar. So I had to go sit in the vault and for an hour and listen to the mass because I couldn't walk outside, you know, in the middle of the mass right out of the altar with my scanner. So yeah, no, it's a good question, but I think certainly, you know, maybe less of these churches, and the Catholic Church is selling off and closing many churches around the world, and what to do with these kind of objects is a real question.
Great. So I'm sorry, I turned off my camera because there's some problem with YouTube. But I have one last question, and I will try to finish this for you not to take longer. The presentation was fantastic, and I think we had a lot of almost everything of your work covered. So I will just ask one more thing that it's in relation to the survey. It seems like the month and a half that you spent in Rome was just the beginning of a survey, because afterwards, well, you comment about the passing from points to meshes, but on top of that, then you develop this seminar where you take fragments so you can see more in detail on different angles, and then on top of that, you made transformations on those fragments, even to the point to generate new objects using symmetry and, I don't know, unfolding them, folding them again in different shapes. So, I don't know, I was thinking that maybe what you are doing, in fact, is continue that survey, trying to elaborate on new ways to see these buildings. That I think that's all the purpose of what you're doing. You're trying to see these buildings in more and more ways, more and more different ways. And I was wondering if there's other style of architecture that you will be interested in do something like this, like some sort of, I mean, clearly the scanning process and the afterwards work, it's better with very complex and texturous architecture, and there's a lot of that architecture around. So I was wondering if you are thinking about going forward and expand this universe into I don't know, new territories that you find interesting.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great question. Me personally, you know, I hope it's inspiring for people to look at it and say it doesn't have to be the Baroque, right? It could work, you know, it can be a way to work on anything, you know, it doesn't have to be Western architecture. There's many non-Western architects that are interesting, could be open up in that way. I think, you know, from an immediate standpoint, I probably would be interested in maybe looking a little bit at south of Rome, Sicily, you know, these kind of things, because you know, this was Rome, and then up in the Piedmont area, which it's not a, you know, by no means is a complete survey of that, but it does start to operate with really key works within those. And the southern Italy is a little bit, well, it's not represented, you know, not even underrepresented in that. So I think that would be my, you know, I feel like there's still a little bit more to add to this as a collection to kind of understand those, but certainly, you know, the Baroque and the Catholic Church, the way that was, you know, spread to Latin Americas and, you know, yourself, you know, Argentina, you know, the US, you know, we really didn't get very much of that, if any, here, because it was really settled by Protestants who are very much about church reform, and sort of Catholicism didn't really land here in the same way that it did in, you know, other sort of colonized sort of areas. And a lot of those have really interesting mixes with culture that are really a whole different animal than the sort of Roman Baroque, which would be interesting as well, right? And then maybe answer to the beginning of the survey. Yeah, I think when I was, surveying for the month and a half when I had the scanner, I was just really concerned with getting as much information as I could. And I remember after that coming back to Philadelphia, and I had hard drives full of millions and millions and millions of points, but I really didn't have any idea how to put it all together in terms of technology, especially at that point, because a lot of it was, this stuff has become much more accessible now. I mean, now people are starting to work on their iPhones through photogrammetry and these kind of things that are really starting to become pretty compelling. But at that point, thank goodness that I had a lot of really good students at Penn, a lot of good contacts at different companies like Autodesk and Faro, who really were willing to help out and support the project and work with it. And so that was the challenge of the project, not only gathering the information, but coming back and seeing what to do with it. And when I published the book, the timing was that I was on tenure, so I needed to get the book out while I was going up to tenure. But I thought there was enough information just of showing those scans, sort of what they are. I think there's a whole nother book that would be maybe dedicated to the more speculative analysis work, right? But I thought that the people could enjoy and digest just those at face value. But it has continued, and that has been kind of a question of really what to do this. I think architecture really hasn't yet, but is starting to kind of accept reality capture, LiDAR, these things as part of a representational canon, where they have accepted it as an empirical measuring device that can verify things, like engineers, as built, all of these kind of things. It has been accepted there. But in terms of, pushing it in terms of its representational value and understanding how transformative that representational value could be, in the same way that perspective and any of the other kind of major breakthroughs in representation are, I still think it's a little bit underdeveloped. It hasn't developed. Architects' reception of it from a discursive point of view has not developed as quickly as the technology itself. But yeah, I think that's always the case. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think that's it. Thank you very much, Andrew, for doing this. Always a pleasure to talk to you and see your work. And let's keep in touch and make this, published. I will make sure that this video is on YouTube, well edited, so it becomes accessible for everyone. So thank you very much for doing this. Hope you had a good time.
Thanks for the invitation. Always a pleasure. And thanks for all the people out there that's helped me with this project. This project is a big project, and it's been a long project, and it's been it has a lot of contributors and collaborators. So it's sort of a living project. It by no means is just me, so it's been really fun to work with, and a lot of people have been very supportive. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. See you soon.
All right. See ya.